As retailers entered the lockdown in March 2020, a small, diverse group of Canadian thought leaders gathered to virtually speculate, collaborate, and share their insights on the waves of disruption facing retailers. The Business of Retail podcast emerged as an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional discourse, revealing challenges in the headlines and exploring new, unconventional paths for all facets of the retail industry. Now, here's the panel.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Business of Retail podcast series. I'm Craig Patterson. I'm joined here with Gary Newbury, George Minikakis, and David Ian Gray. And today we're going to be talking about a few things, including what does retailers that are going to survive this look like, and what does surviving retail really mean? So one observation I had off the bat that we'll talk about a little bit is one thing I'm seeing is in the case of, say, shopping center landlords, some are looking at which retail concepts, or I guess general tenants, could survive into the future, and they're helping and supporting those, and those that they don't think have longevity. In some cases, they're actually saying, you're off on your own type of thing. So we're going to jump into a bit of a conversation here and talk a bit about the future of retail, who's going to succeed and how that's going to look like.
Well, I think that's a great point of departure because that's one lens, which is the landlord lens. I'm not convinced landlords really get it right even half the time. And maybe that's a little provocative. Too bad we don't have a landlord on the podcast with us. But I think their ability to see the future of retail and really define health of a concept is really spotty. So I'll throw that out there, but at least it is a play that's happening in real time, which is they are picking.
Yeah, if I don't know if you follow in what Simon Property Group are doing. They buy in retail concepts. Well, my argument here is that if they were good at retailing, if they were retailer first, property company second, wouldn't they have a whole bunch of banners, very successful, very relevant, just because they're picking them off at pence on the dollar or cent on the dollar, doesn't make them suddenly relevant, doesn't make them suddenly profitable, doesn't make them suddenly competent even.
Well, I also wonder how the landlord model works when the power in that enterprise resides with, let's call it hotshot leasing guys, mostly guys, and they make a lot of money, and they make that money quarterly. Like their window that they look at is here and now and maybe a year out. So that's the culture, the operating culture of that business, all the way up to the pension funds in Canada. So I wonder how they can look to what's going to survive and succeed in 3 to 5 years that may not be doing as well today, versus, hey, who can we grab today that's making a crap load of money right in them, whoever's left doing that. I mean,
yeah, exactly. But what's interesting is when Craig mentioned it just now as an introduction, the first thing that came to my mind, only because I ran across this nursery rhyme the other day, it was about Humpty Dumpty, right? So this is kind of Humpty Dumpty world to me, right? You're trying to rebuild Humpty Dumpty, but he fell off the wall, and there's nothing you can do to put it together again. I mean, it's Amazon's going to move in, and somehow this is going to change the world. How does Amazon or anyone else going in there becoming using that space to distribute and ship product out, unless you have a little bit of an outlet to pick something up? How does that change anything for a mall, right? And I agree with you, Gary. You look at these developers. Suddenly they're becoming retailers by buying all these chains. Well, why? Right? I mean, to me, it's no different than a restructure, right? So, and most of the companies, retailers, they go through a restructure, they don't survive. And I'm going to say that Jacobs, for you guys who remember Jacobs, they went through 2 restructures and finally went bankrupt. Right. And I think in the second restructure, I don't think they were open for more than 9 months. So it's
with only a couple of stores, right? I think they really pared.
It wasn't a lot left
to speak of.
Yeah.
They were a killer concept back in the first half of the 2000s.
Well merchandised, good fashion, everything, and they were gone.
Just to your point, George, bearing in mind that Amazon was made in US, It's a very big market, lots of opportunities, lots of kind of people bringing concepts to market. And they may represent, and I'm talking old figures because it may have all kind of got jumbled up over the last few months, but they did represent something like 50% of e-commerce, which is quite outstanding in 20 years. We built up a good base, but also they only represent 4% of retail sales. So Amazon isn't fundamentally a big fighting force in retail. Maybe Walmart is, and they're having their own struggles and trying to reorientate themselves. But when we talk about Amazon and how e-commerce is going to completely flatten bricks and mortar, we have to remind ourselves of some of the facts around here, that even though, Jeff Bezos has got, parts of his business and it's all amalgamated together and that they generate cash across the whole set of services to generate enough cash to kind of almost fund retailing, even given that, it only represents something in the order of 4%. And it's one of those moments, let that sink in for a moment, guys. But it's not as devastating as people might want to believe and may hang their hat on. Well, of course, it's the Amazon effect. What do you expect us to do? Well, at 4%, it's not a big player still.
Well, George, your recent post was really focused on physical retail, right? And the challenges, but I don't think any of us on this discussion believe physical retail's dead as a format.
Nope.
And I just had a call from a U.S. media source to comment on the rumor that Amazon is looking at Sears, JCPenney properties in the U.S. and they were going to open up, I think, Craig, was it 2,000 or 3,000 Amazon Go stores across North America, mostly U.S. this year was the plan in January. So even Amazon is banking somewhat on physicality. Mm-hmm. But the question that you raised, Craig, was sort of like, what is, the retail that's going to survive? How is that defined, and who gets to decide it?
And what I think part of this might even be is the willingness for some of these retailers to at least attempt to innovate, because I think that some of the brands that we've seen these landlords attempt to support aren't necessarily known to be super innovative. Brooks Brothers being one of them. Simon, partnered, I think, with Associated Brands groups to purchase that brand. They may be looking to do a reset because, it's a heritage brand. And one thing that we've seen with various heritage brands, particularly those that are high end, is that they've been reinvented and that they can continue to be reinvented while still maintaining that story. And it's really very much a brand story that's there that can be brought into modern times. And I'm wondering if that's part of it, because sometimes it's actually, the leadership team with certain businesses where say, some landlords or analysts will be like, well, they're not going to change. This is not going to work long term. But with other ones that they're saying, well, I can see a future here. We could make some tweaks here. We could change something there. That might be part of it right there. Are they willing to, get with this new digital age? Are they willing to do some really interesting things, limited edition collaborations? There's all kinds of things that we're seeing these new generation, younger brands doing, and doing it with quite a bit of success, that some of these older retailers that have been doing the same thing for years aren't willing or able to do.
Well, that sort of presupposes, I think, like we can all run and do that, but which I agree with. But I think the discipline that will have to emerge, it's bound to emerge, is the ability to create a health check, on a category or a sector, but specifically on individual concepts. And that health check has to include leading indicators that you could look at and go, yeah, this is a signal that these guys are on the right track to do such and such. Like right now, it's almost guesswork, but we tend to fall back on traditional metrics like sales per square foot or comps, store sales, or whatever it might, margins. And something tells me we need a different kind of discipline around what health means. Like, what is a healthy concept going to look like?
I think that just looking at, I call it the retail concept life cycle, but I think it can be shortened to retail life cycle. But that general product life cycle curve, trying to understand where we are. Are we in growth? Are we in saturation where we're getting good margins, high volume, or decline? And I think that many retailers are in decline, and they're not recognizing what the real strategy of moving them out of decline is, which is reinvention. And they're kind of finding ingenious ways of removing service, of finding cheaper products, proliferating the range with cheap stuff, trying to get a different type of segment to come into the format. What they're not doing is reinventing, not changing their format, going from big format, big box format, to smaller, more purposeful, story bound retail concept, which would be a reinvention. So if we were able to plot that, that would be a very easy kind of tick box thing. Are we in? Which stage are we in? And that would then, although you may be looking like you seem to be generating some cash, but actually, where are you on that transition from start to dead?
Gary, in that approach, I mean, it probably lends itself to all categories. But I think in this discussion, it's also worth probably talking about different categories. Like a convenience store as a concept might warrant a different discussion than, say, mid-market fashion, and when you think of malls, what is really in all the malls, it's mid-market fashion. But I kind of wonder, but it sounds like what you're talking about has some stretch to it, and you could apply it theoretically to most categories.
The banks have a bank stress test, right? So when I wrote the first book, I had written about a retail stress test, and I didn't really take a deep dive into it, but I just covered it off more or less superficially because it's a good subject. But to your point, David, I mean, retailers do need to have that level of health check, whether you call it a retail stress test or whatever you call it. They do need to be doing it regularly. So it's a brand health check. Right? Because and good retailers are all constantly checking their brand health check, constantly, and when I look at it today, I don't think everyone has been has had as much conviction behind that as others have, right? I'm sure the luxury brands are probably checking that very frequently, right? Some of the premium brands might be that still need, know they need to be in the game. But this isn't not an expensive exercise. It really isn't. With the cost of doing surveys coming down so much these days, you can do a lot of brand health checks very low cost, and just not doing them. But you could learn a lot about the fact of the issues, friction issues the consumer has, right? Issues they have with convenience, issues they have with the product, issues they have with service. You can do a lot of that at a very low cost and better understand how you're executing. I think if you were doing all of those things on a regular basis, maybe semi-annually at the very least, you would find out, where the pressure points are to your business relative to your competitors and relative to e-commerce, and how your brand resonates on e-commerce basis. Lots of things could have been done in advance. But I think those types of health checks or stress tests need to become the norm out there. Otherwise, you're just going to have this revolving door of retailers coming and going.
Yeah, and probably even the financiers right now are on shaky ground in terms of really being solid on that kind of formula. I sense there's this transition from the old world and the old models to the new happening right through the ecosystem. Hey, Craig, you track in the Canadian contents, particularly, you track with so much rigor who's coming and who's going. Are you seeing a pattern with, even through COVID, the new entrants, or who are at least purported to be eyeing Canada? Is there something different right now about those than there might have been 2 years ago, or do they look basically same old, same old?
Well, we've certainly seen a slowdown in, say, international brands looking at the market, but those that are, and those that have just opened, Away Luggage is one example, which will launch an expansion. Um, these are brands that are opening stores, firstly. Secondly, they're brands that have a story. They also may have venture capital behind them, which can be a little scary sometimes because they expect performance. But it seems like a lot of the brands, if they're not a TJX or an off-price type of dollar store, et cetera, if they're more in the mid-price and higher, very often they're an actual brand which is looking to control their message. One of the interesting things that I've seen is, and we've talked about this before in terms of department stores and other multi-brand retailers. In years past, brands would try to get into those, but now that the multi-brands have been struggling with their orders, we're seeing these brands saying, well, why don't I just do it myself? Why don't I create my own environment? And again, it's, I think, a storytelling exercise where they can open their own physical store, control the entire experience that the consumer is having, from the staff to the interior, the merchandise, education. What's the future of the multi-brand? So I think that we'll see more brands opening stores, and I think that we'll see fewer of the multi-brands. One other thing is, I'm just thinking about some of the ladies fashion retailers that we currently have, some of the ones that we've had before. They may have been a little bit dressy in terms of the clothing styles. They may have catered to an older generation. Well, that older generation isn't buying as much clothing. We do have a lot of old retail concepts. I mean, I don't know if we want to call this retail Darwinism. I mean, that's a rather harsh thing to say, but there's a survival of the fittest, and there's also a survival of what people want. And if retail concepts don't have what the consumer is looking for, or if they're not communicating what the consumer wants, I see, failure potentially, which is really unfortunate because there's a lot of retailers out there that I think are stale.
Craig, I like the metaphor of Darwin and Darwinism because, part of that is the requirement that a species has to adapt, right? Like the whole premise is, as the environment changes, a species that survives are the most adaptive to the changing environment. So that's a great metaphor. No apology there needed.
Yeah. And there's some brands out there right now that are doing higher sales than they were last year at this time. And that's pretty mind-blowing if you think about it, because there are certainly some retailers and other, businesses that are absolutely struggling right now. It's been a real challenge, but I won't say them publicly because I think some might be confidential, but I know a few brands out there that are doing extremely well. I know a jewelry chain that has, a store in Edmonton that's very well known. Their sales were up 40% over last year at this time. That's absolutely incredible. So brands that are telling their stories, have products that people want, and are getting to that consumer, in some cases are very, very successful, even during COVID.
So here's back to the theme of, how do you get your hands around who will survive in a Darwinian fashion? I hear you when you say direct to consumer, the brands going directly themselves. But I think back over the last few years, and I've met brand owners and senior brand people who are charged with developing retail, and you get a whole mishmash. Like, you get those saying that the owners are just telling us to open up stores and do a joint venture with whoever will pony up some money in a new country just because they want the revenues. And then you get other people who are, as you say, saying we want to control a brand story and be part of a bigger omni approach. But just the fact that they're a brand going into retail, I don't think makes them a sure winner. And I don't want to knock someone like Herschel, for example, but I don't know how Herschel's retail operations are doing, but I don't think there's anything special about Herschel stores at all. And I, as one example, and then, on the other hand, I think the Dyson stores are kind of cool. Like, you're realizing they stand for a lot more than vacuums.
Yeah, Mulberry, I thought, was a very strong brand at one time, the high-end bags, and they got into fashion. They're based out of London, UK. I had high hopes for them when they came into Canada in 2013, but the brand kind of went stale. They didn't release new products. The consumer can be quite fickle in certain segments of the retail market, and if brands aren't providing something, that consumers are saying, oh, I need to have this. I mean, having something new and having something limited edition seems to work really well. Mulberry failed in Canada. It failed in a lot of markets, and that's really too bad. But then you see brands like Versace and Balenciaga, which consumers are just like, oh my God, I need this now. Those that are fans of the brand, they're all over these brands. It's really incredible. Even during COVID, Fendi released a line which sold out within days, if not even sooner.
Well, I'd love to know behind the scenes what the difference is. And I do fear that some direct-to-consumer plays just see retail as a surefire win, or a way to get around their own envy of retail taking margin from them when they're wholesaling. And I don't think that's good enough. I think if you're going to do retail, retail's not easy. Like, it's not a sure thing. And I think the ones who are doing well may have got the right people in play and are making an investment. I think Jordan, I think in China back and forth over the years, and that's probably a great litmus test, because it was kind of easy to open up there. But did you notice a difference between different?
Yeah, and what's interesting in China was that I won't say which brand it was, but I was at a luxury trade show in Shanghai, and the person running one luxury brand, they had about 8 locations, and he said in China, and they said, your store, we go into your stores, they're always empty. Why is that? And his comment was, it's not about our sales in China, it's about our global sales. And and that speaks to the brand again, right? Because the Chinese don't buy locally in China. They travel. Now, they're not traveling today, I'm pretty sure, but they travel. And where do they go? What's the number one destination? Italy, right? Paris, right? So you go to Rome, you go to Paris, and you buy the luxury goods. If you're in Rome, you go near the Spanish Steps, if you've ever been there, and there's a Ferragamo store just down the pike in a laneway. Take a look who's shopping, right? I mean, the Asians consumer is there and they're buying. So the presence, the big part about, I think, David, when you were mentioning about brands themselves, when you look at luxury, right? Luxury brands live somewhere up here, right? They try very hard to have their social purpose, to make sure they're environmentally friendly, that they don't say anything, that's provocative, that offends anyone. They're very, very careful, right? And because everything is about the brand, and they succeed because on that level, right? They don't make any mistakes. You don't find, you may find the founder at the front of the page, right, talking about the values of the brand, and it helps the brand grow, and people love it. So, like you were talking about Fendi, product's gone, right? Why? Because it's the same story, right? There's something they have an infatuation with the brand. And in China, if you couldn't afford your brand, you wore your brand on a T-shirt, right? And you saw a lot of Chinese consumers who they all have a passion for the future. They all see that you can get rich, and that you can live a good life, and that you can buy all these great products. Because then they look at luxury, by the way. They also look at luxury in terms of, I'm buying a product that's going to last a lifetime. They don't buy products because it's just a matter of having it. They do that, but they buy it because it's made to last, right? That is not the Western consumer, though. Generally, that is not the Western consumer. And I think that's part of retail's fault, because we've never been in a world where we make things to last, right? It's always about turnover, right? So that hurts your reputation ultimately.
I've just got a feeling that we have to, in retail, understand the concept of free markets to generate value on the basis that if you're not generating value, I'll come back to that in a minute, your brand will be irrelevant, you'll be unprofitable. You may choose to go through CCAA for, I don't know, political purposes, or, you can't face up to saying I'm closing my business because really I didn't track the market very well. So how do we evaluate organizations who are not generating value, but know how to generate value because they're actually talking to the consumers and really working out what those consumers, they've identified segments, and within that segment, they're really engaging that community in trying to figure out what is the value that you're looking for, and here's my products, there it is. Okay, I'm relevant, I'm profitable, I'm generating cash flow, I don't need to go to CCAA or Chapter 11, whatever it might be. So I think that one of the kind of acid tests, and it's really kind of the benchmark thing that you were talking about earlier, George, is how do we know if we're a retailer, if we're in the right space on this mental space or mental model, whatever you like to call it? Because if we haven't got a process by which we're actually engaging with the consumers, not nominally looking at data and pouring over that and saying, oh, this is the assumption we're working on. How do we know what's our process really look like that delivers an authentic read of consumers, so we can move things around, change the impression of our products, our stores, our e-commerce fulfillment, to make sure that those people understand that we are delivering the value they've asked for, and ideally being beyond that and delighting them in that exchange.
Well, I think, yeah, and it goes back to what are the early indicators, both for the leadership to know, but even as an outsider, if you're a major vendor selling in, or if you're a landlord, or if you're a financer of retail, I think the idea of what are the indicators that would, if those boxes get checked or scored high, there's a good chance these guys are going to emerge the other side. And I don't have the answer to it right now, but we did some work a number of years ago with one of the major shopping center chains with their head office, where we were evaluating a very major retailer for them as an outside lens that was in big trouble, and they were trying to decide, whether they would try and help it get through. And we were kind of borrowing from a business model canvas approach, but we were looking at all sorts of the business, but really simplistic, like red, yellow, green kind of color coding. But one of the things we were looking at was the fact it was a legacy multi-generation business. And we were trying to see how much fresh talent was coming in as an indicator, for example, at senior levels versus, within the family perpetuating. And I'm not saying we were right with that. Like, I don't know, but I think we need to freshen up our way that we kind of look at if it's innovation, if it's customer centricity, if it's brand with purpose. What are some things that we could check really quickly and say, yeah, if they're doing that?
I think a very simple check, and it's, sort of leveraging off of what George said earlier, is that tick list. Have I, one, got a defined process by which I engage my consumers to understand their needs and wants? And how do I then take that information, how do I process that information, and what changes do I make to my proposition, my format, the products, the assortment, blah, blah, blah? I think that we can look at metrics, but actually I would rather see a process mapped and some kind of checklist around that we've performed that process in the last 2 weeks. So, because I'm much more interested in the inputs around that process than some metrics which may be open to interpretation. So I'm not saying perhaps I am saying I'm highly process driven, but who knows? But I would like to see organizations have clear processes that they follow, procedures, processes that they follow, and they relentlessly follow these processes, and they have a defined frequency which allows them to say, yes, we're still in touch, and we're making small changes to this. Oh, the consumers change. Why is that change? I don't know. Has a segment moved around? Yes, okay, we've understood that. Then we may need to make a big change to maybe our format, our assortment, how we greet customers, all small things, big things. But I want to see that cycle of activity as opposed to just a series of metrics which are in some ways grafted onto an organization which probably may not be doing that. We're trying to get some insight by selecting metrics which may not be the right metrics, because the metrics should reflect the intention of process as opposed to the intention of just some kind of random result.
Well, and I may have misspoken as well, because I was kind of thinking both qualitative and quantitative, so that some of these might be more observations than here's the number. But I'd also like to think, if we're going through some big change, the leadership understands that this might be a playbook moment where we need to ideate versus continuing to try and tweak a score on an existing process. Yeah. And I'll pause. I've been going on a little bit here, so George, go.
So you know what? If I could just help us kind of wrap it up a little bit, it's, you know, I always think about how are you investing your capital, right? And if you look at any other retailer versus luxury, and if we just define it value this way, how much money are you investing in capital in innovation? And is the innovation driven to lower costs or improve the customer experience, right? Is the capital investment into developing the brand to lower costs and how much you're spending in marketing, or is it to enhance the customer's experience, right? Again, and if you look at luxury again, I'll bet you I know they spend more, I don't know how much more, but they spend a lot more money in training the front staff than any other retailer does. A lot of money. And I know that because when I was in China, we had hired someone who came from a luxury brand to lead our training team. And they spend a great deal of money. So again, all that capital is being invested, but all of this is to create value. So what value are you creating? Are you creating value for the long term, or are you creating value for the short term? That's the big challenge.
Yep. Timeline. We so rarely talk about timeline when we talk about goals and performance.
And if you talk about innovation technology, how many retailers are out there? And in fact, a lot of service businesses, not just retail, when they invest capital in technology, usually the outcome is lowering payroll costs. It's not always leading to higher sales, right? They've somehow justified, well, this investment in capital investment in technology will improve our productivity. Therefore, we can reduce hours, right? Productive hours. And that's what ends up happening. And that is the biggest hurt that I have seen in traditional retailing happen in Canada and the US, elsewhere as well, because you have taken that value piece component out from service. And so you start creating that health check, David, start adding those back in, right? And then you'll see how you measure failure or success going forward. It has to be on those three principles. It has to be on innovation, what you put in the brand, and what you're putting at training. Because otherwise, what have you got?
Well, and George, you know, before we started the call today, we were chatting a little bit about your recent post and observations, and a bit of a provocative comment about letting, and I think in parentheses, bad retail, close parentheses, fail. Like because we're going through this rapid transformation, but it is also COVID, which is taking a toll on a lot of businesses that might otherwise be viable, right? But I couldn't agree with you more that as we think through this, there is a lot of bad retail. And when times were really good, a lot of it was kind of kept afloat just because consumers were buying all over the place. And I liked your comment. I think what is particularly scary is independent retail that doesn't have that kind of cash reserve. And I think a lot of that we've talked about before can get wiped out, even if they're very well run. But believe you me, as much as I defend independent retail, there is a lot of crappy mom and pop retail out there. And, you know, in some ways, Darwinian ways, regardless of COVID, it would have made it anyway.
Yeah. Well, and it didn't have to be COVID. It could have been another financial crash that was worse than the last one, right? That would have pushed everybody over the edge as well. So I agree. It's you know, it's a great discussion to have, you know, in terms of how do you define, you know, what saving retail looks like. It won't be, you know, how we perceived it in the past, and I hope it's not. I really hope it changes, because their survival depends on it. You know, and I hope they invest a lot more in technology. I hope I think we've had this discussion before where technology companies invest in some of these retailers to prove their concepts, as their innovation as well, because I believe that is a way to measure success also. But it's going to take time. This is not going to happen overnight. I think we're in for a ride for the next 3 to 5 years of this roller coaster ride. It's accelerating. I'm not sold that that e-commerce is going to be 50%. I just not sold there. I'm not. I think that's fantasy. And it sells stuff. So, but I am sold that yes, the fundamentals of retail have to change. Physical retail is in trouble. Mall developer, commercial retailer, real estate developers are going to have their hands full. May see some failures there too. I anticipate it. But there's new retailers that will come out of this, because every year there's 95,000 stores that close, and every year about 94 or 95,000 stores that open. Now we may not see that again, right? But there is this Darwinian thing that's happening, right? You're seeing more. Some go and more come in. I don't think it's the end of the world. I just think it's the beginning of a new world.
Well, here, I'll leave with a question that I struggle with. I don't have the answer to, but academically thinking, is there a critical mass of some form of retail that's at least short-run viable that is required for the ecosystem to remain healthy enough for that resurgence to happen? In other words, if we have an extended period of COVID restrictions on traffic to stores, or maybe even another shutdown, and we're not even talking about food service and restaurants, could we lose so many businesses that landlords turn to other developments and turn to other uses, and vendors who sell product through retail go out of business, and maybe even tech innovators no longer have the carrot ahead of them to innovate? And maybe I'm being a little bit dramatic with that. I don't know, but I just wonder it.
My thought as I listen to the question, it's quite a retail centric question, and I think that we could somehow modify it to think of what would happen if consumers lost so much confidence that, or run out of so much money because they've been very heavily leveraged, that they would like to go shopping, but actually have got no money. What does that do to actually affect those things that you've just described? So I would sort of preface your question with what would have to happen to consumers before all those things, those almost catastrophes, became realities.
Read Time magazine article on an economic depression that's coming. They're pretty firm on the writer of the article is pretty firm that it is coming.
Gary. The problem there, Gary, with your point is that right now, either through dictate or through social pressure, we are telling retailers that they cannot generate the traffic that their business models traditionally have been built on. And yeah, you have to innovate, but you need money maybe to do some of that. You're in this bind right now. And I think there are some that happen to, we spoke about Indigo as an example, where there happens to be the luck or good fortune or skills somewhere of having a big war chest behind it to weather it. That doesn't mean it's a better concept than another who didn't build that up right now. And and again, these are the things like what, I think we all would want to see, for the sake of our economies, our societies, as well as consumers, you need to have some kind of critical mass of competition that's viable and some thriving energy in the future. And TBD, but maybe there is a need for us to collectively as a society and the shippers and the innovators and the landlords to think, hey, maybe we do need to push a few more forward than just let Darwin have its way.
Yep. I think part of the challenge there is if tomorrow somehow office workers return back to the central business district, kids could go safely back to school, all of a sudden, I'm not going to say the acceleration stops, but I believe that the economy bounces back very quickly. if everybody could go back to work with confidence, could put their kids back to school with confidence, the world changes in a very different direction, right? Regrettably, I don't think that that's the way it's going to play out. But I do believe, historically, independents have always survived. Many of them have survived, right? And a few of them have gone on, as independents for a long time, or they've gone on and become a chain, right? So no chain that we know of few of them have ever started with more than one store. Everybody starts with a single shop, and I think somewhere out there are these independents who are going to create brand new chains, right? I don't believe it, only it's going to be different, right? They're going to be connected to the internet. They're going to be on social media. They're going to be very recognized with a lot less effort than a lot of these larger current chains have to put through. Yes. And I think that's the world and that's the world that I'm expecting personally.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be a shame in some ways that the large guys, the big box store national chains, got all the business because the independents collapsed, and only a few of them survived, but not so many that they could go on to describe, to that kind of scenario you described. We need the independents to survive. The good ones, the ones well managed, and the ones that show that they can move fast, because the big chains tend not to move very fast, and we don't want the retail economy retail thinking to slow right back down to where it has been for decades.
But that's not, you know what, Gary, though, I know, David, I know you want to say something, but I got to say this part, that, when Craig said about survival of the fittest, the fact that the independents could fail and bad, underperforming chains could fail, the survivors are not necessarily better retailers.
Thank you. That was kind of you said it better than I did.
So they end up with a windfall. They don't end up, being lasting because they did something better. That's the difference. And I think that's what we're going to see.
And I think even the big guys know, and I know a lot of leaders in those companies that know that they need a pretty vibrant array of retail around them for themselves to do well.
Yeah.
In the longer run.
Yep. Yeah. Lack of competition is not healthy.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. This is the Business of Retail podcast series. I'm Craig Patterson, and I'm with Gary Newbury, George Minikakis, and David Ian Gray today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
You have been listening to the Business of Retail podcast, an unflinching strategic alternative to the conventional industry discourse. Thank you for joining us. For more information, please go to www.thebusinessofretail.ca.